So you want to start a new game, but where do you start? Do you design the campaign? Do you choose a pre-generated world for you to play your game in? Or do you homebrew your own world? Seriously, where do you begin? Write in the comments down below. Where do you start? Hello, my fellow GMs. My name is Guy, and today we are looking at the very first step in our world-building campaign design process, and that step is designing, or choosing, I should say, where to start. Where do we start? Is it with designing a world? Is it with choosing an existing world? Is it with designing our campaign? We need to have a starting point. We have to plant our flag somewhere, and so we need to choose. But how do we choose? Well, that's what we're going to be covering in today's video. Now, if you like the content so far, please hit the like button. And I mean the content for the past few weeks, this whole series. We need to know that this is something that you are enjoying and that you are deriving benefit from. A lot of you in the commentary a couple of videos ago said that you are deriving benefit from this. I really thank you for that commentary. If you didn't say it in that video, say it now. Let us know so we can continue doing these things. Now, this week's sponsor is none other than my personal favorites, the ultimate, the best, the coolest, the most wonderful. I got to play D&D with them on the weekend a couple weekends ago, and it was fantabulous. These are the amazing folks of Dungeon Fog. I cannot tell you how many maps I have made on the Dungeon Fog platform, and yet, even with all the maps that I have made, and we're talking hundreds of maps here, folks, the community that exists within Dungeon Fog is truly one of its strengths. Apart from creating amazing maps, the community public library is massive. 12,000 plus maps shared, which you can literally just select from. Look at these amazing maps here. You can go through, you can search for specific types of maps. You can find the map that you need for your game in 10 minutes or less. You are up and running. You can modify it once you've cloned it, change the colors, change the lighting, do whatever it is you need to do, but you instantly have access to all of these different kinds of maps within Dungeon Fog. Truly an amazing resource. If you like to use beautiful maps, why go anywhere else? Dungeon Fog, it is the ultimate battle map maker. If you haven't yet started using Dungeon Fog, I suppose it's because you maybe don't design maps or you use something else. Either way, as long as you're having fun, that's the bottom line. So when we get back to designing maps, do we have to design maps for pre-generated worlds? Do we have to design maps for our own worlds? Do we have to design maps if we're designing a campaign first? Where do we start? Well, I always like to make lists, and then I look at those lists and I kind of chalk off the positives and the negatives, and then I see which one has more positives and which one has more negatives, and then I kind of go with that. So that's what I'm going to be doing with you, hopefully today, as we go through the process. So of the three, you come up with the campaign idea first. What are some of the benefits of this? Well, by coming up with a campaign idea first, you can immediately start to set your goals. Well, I have the goal that I want my players to have an absolutely amazing time, and I think that my campaign is going to do that because it's about them saving the entire planet from an alien invasion or an invasion of outsiders. Let's be a little bit less specific at this present moment in time. So they're saving the planet from a whole bunch of outsiders. That's really cool. That's given you some goals, and you are free to come up with anything that you could possibly want in terms of designing your campaign. You're not constrained in a negative way. You are giving yourself some constraints. You have to have a planet, you have to have the heroes in a position in which they will be able to save said planet, and you have to have some kind of outsider invader coming in. We've already got a whole bunch of constraints that are just giving us, well, 3 adventures at the very least that we now can start moving forward on. Do you see how just listing some of these things is really beneficial? Now, we are also free, and I kind of mentioned it already. Another positive is that we are also free to create anything that our minds can come up with. So if we want to have our player characters all riding giant dragons into this battle to save the planet from these outsiders, well, we can do that. We can just add it in. Okay, they're flying giant dragons. Great, that's a 4th adventure at the very least. They have to go and get their dragon or tame their dragon or save their dragon or learn how to ride a dragon. I mean, that could be, there's a whole movie franchise based on training a dragon. So do you see how just by thinking about what kind of game we're going to be running, we've already got a whole bunch of adventures coming out. So That's another major positive, that we are free to create as we desire, as we want to, and we can just add. We are also free to change things. So, but the planet that they're on, that they're trying to save anyway, let's say that's exploded outwards. So it's actually an exploded planet, which is something that I did for a game that I ran for Save or Dice a long time ago. It was a lot of fun. So I can change the physics of how things work. I'm really not constrained by anything. So those are three very big positives in my mind as to why you might start with your campaign first. We'll look at the negatives at the end of the video. The positive of starting with a pre-made world, with a world that someone else has made. There are positives. Absolutely there are. Many of us run our games that way. I saw a poll recently where it was on one of the Facebook groups. It was a poll on GMs. Do you use pre-made or do you use homebrew? Or do you use bits and pieces and cobble it together? And the outcome was 50% used pre-gen and 50% used homebrew. I think we have to define pre-gen though, because a pre-generated world is not just one that lives in a book that you've bought and that you've opened up and started to use. Pre-generated worlds are any worlds that are already in existence that you as the GM didn't make. So Star Trek is a pre-generated world. Star Wars, My Little Pony, Gummy Bears universe, all of those spaces are pre-generated. They come with a whole bunch of expectations. Remember we were talking about expectations a couple of videos ago? Well, here they are coming to bite us, or at least to help us, depending on how we want to use them. So they help us because we go, well, if we're going to set this in the Marvel universe, we know that there are certain constraints. Not entirely sure what those constraints are because Marvel had a massive shift over time as different writers came in and all this kind of stuff. But we generally know that there are superheroes that have superpowers because of a whole bunch of freaky radiation accidents or stellar radiation accidents or just by being geniuses. And then there's a whole bunch of plebs who don't know anything and continue to run their daily lives, completely unaffected by these mega events that are going on. So a pre-generated world gives us constraints. So that means that if we choose the pre-generated world of Marvel, we can't have planet Earth exploded outwards into multiple different shells unless we establish that that world is in a parallel dimension or a subdimension or a pocket dimension, somewhere where Doctor Strange hasn't come along and buggered things up, or where, you know, something has gone on. It could be in a parallel universe. Do you see, though, that we have to use the constraints that the pre-generated world is giving us to modify our original idea or to modify ideas that we might be having? So we're not as free as we were when we were just coming up with a campaign before we chose the world. We are being controlled and constrained. I think that's a good thing. It's forcing you to think, I have this big idea, how do I fit it into this space? How do I make this thing work? We also have a lot of pre-generated characters that are running around. So now, when we have our heroes and we're going, well, we want our heroes to try and save the planet, there are a whole bunch of other established heroes that would be doing exactly this. So why aren't they doing it? Why are the PCs doing it? These are very good questions to ask because they're giving us constraints. Well, the main heroes are busy doing something else. The PCs are going to be doing something a lot more integral to the entire plot, but smaller perhaps. Or perhaps the PCs are more powerful than the existing canon characters that have been established, in which case we need to do that. We need to establish that. So just as when we were coming up with our campaign, when we are choosing a pre-generated world, we are getting a whole lot of adventures just from kind of trying to fit these various ideas into this space. So there are a lot of positives. We also don't have to come up with many things about the world or the lore because they've already been generated for us. That's really useful. That's really, really powerful to know that if your knowledge of the Star Trek universe is complete, it's very, very good, you are not relying on your imagination to create stuff. You are simply relying on your memory to remember, oh yes, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, and it's happening at these different times and things. So it takes the burden of creation off of you, and it does give you a little bit of a burden of the memory, but that's not too much here or there. So that's if you're choosing a pre-generated world. Those are some of the benefits. Now, there are many more benefits. I'm just giving you like the ones that I think illustrate the point the best. When you are creating your own world, that is then when you kind of are coming up with your campaign first, but you're creating your world space first, which is giving you a lot of constraints by generating it. So if you make your own world, you kind of hold this world in the palm of your hand, you are free to do as you choose. You want an exploded world? It's an exploded world. You want to have a world where there are superheroes, but it's not the DC universe, it's not the Marvel universe, it is your own universe where the player characters could potentially be the most powerful and not conflict with what has already been established in the pre-generated worlds. You can do that. If you want to have worlds where there's no particular color, or there's one color missing, or physics works differently, you can do that. You are literally opening up an entire space that is just yours. That's a huge benefit. This is the essence of your mind made real. So there's no filtering going on. There is no kind of other components being added to it. It is just yours. That's a major benefit. You can do it however you like. You are also free to populate this world with characters that you, again, want to do. So it's a lot easier to apply your tone to your pre-generated world than it is let me rephrase that completely. It is a lot easier to apply your tone to your homebrew world than it is to your pre-generated world, because your pre-generated world comes with tone already built in, usually. If you look at how at the tones of the Aliens movies, to make a comedic Aliens environment would be very difficult. On the other hand, to create a comedic environment where there are these aliens that burst out of people's chests and then politely stitch them back together, apologizing and then helping pay for the kids' educations, that certainly exists, and we can see that in contrast when you look at spoof movies that try and take very serious movies and turn them into comedy movies. The idea is, though, you are completely free to create your homebrew world, add in all of the components that you want to add into it, and to create the tones that you really want to enjoy and explore. So that leaves you with three still very positive routes that you can take. The campaign, where the world is not important, the pre-generated world, where everything is done basically for you, or the homebrew world, where you are coming up with all of these concepts yourself. So when we then look at the negatives, in terms of coming up with your campaign first rather than the worlds, it's very difficult for you to have a lot of constraints in place because there's nothing to constrain you from a world space point of view. So your campaign can become a little bit unhinged. You can also find that it's very difficult to come up with adventure ideas for your campaign at the early onset because, well, is it difficult for players to get dragons to fly on? We don't know, because the world space doesn't yet exist, but it is integral to your campaign. So you're going to have to go and now figure this out later on, because ultimately you will still have to choose a world space to play in, pre-generated or homebrew, so you are going to have to make that decision at some point. But whilst designing your campaign, you don't have the support of the constraints from those two different states. When you then look at the pre-generated, the biggest problem that you're going to face with using a pre-gen is you then have to remember all of the pre-generated stuff's lore, and that can be incredibly intimidating. That can really, really make you take pause and go, beg your pardon, I have to learn how many decades worth of history? Because if your players know the history and you don't, if they know the world lore for that pre-generated world, they will, not necessarily intentionally, they will be able to take advantage of certain things. For example, if I play Star Trek, I have the wealth of watching every single Star Trek thing that has ever been made, and so when a DM throws a problem, a spatial anomaly, my internal knowledge is huge, and I can say, well, I'm going to run a multiphasic spectral scan, and if that doesn't work, we're going to fire an inverted polaron beam at them, or maybe we're going to flood the area with tachyon particles. I can spew out just as much world lore as the next fanatical Trekkie can. If my DM is not that well versed, they're going to be sitting there going, an inverted polaron beam? That sounds cool. Give me a science roll. That will derail their game if that wasn't their intention. So Pre-generated worlds require you to learn a lot of information and to have it at your fingertips. This doesn't mean that you should not or cannot play in pre-generated worlds that you don't have a lot of knowledge on. Absolutely, that is not what I'm saying. You can, and you can then turn to your players and go, look, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge of this space, so I'm going to rely on you guys to give me that information. Help me to make the game more entertaining. There is nothing wrong with that. And if you're using the pre-generated world of Earth, circa today or in the last 100 years, so if you're using a Victorian setting, for example, and your characters go and visit London, and you have players who are intimately familiar with London and you are not, that is perfectly acceptable to say, folks, you guys are leaving St. Paul's. What are your immediate areas around St. Paul's? Where can your characters go? Someone might say, oh, well, you could go to here, or you could go to there, or you could try and get to the river and cross the river. Okay, great stuff. Let's move forward. Ultimately, though, you want to start to add that knowledge to your repertoire. It'll help your game flow faster. So it is still a learning curve, but you can take it little steps at a time. Remember what Celtic Knots Works did for us a couple of weeks ago with that little thing, that little memory thing? Small steps, folks. So small steps. We're all learning together. Right. So when you then look at your homebrew world that you are creating, the biggest negative, of course, is that you have to create everything and you have very little support from your players. Unless you're like me, in which case the player says, oh, I would like to play a Tabaxi, and you go, I don't have Tabaxi in my world yet. I do now. There's a continent. You tell me, what is the customs of the Tabaxi when they greet each other? What are the customs when they are trading? How do they sound? What do they smell like? What are the clothing styles? What are their attitudes towards politics, etc., etc.? Throw that out onto your player. Don't do it as the game is starting. Do it a little bit beforehand. Let them think about it. And then if during the game something comes up, say, well, you're in charge of Tabaxi. Tell me how this plays out. Show me what this does. Let them be involved. That's one way of doing it. But you still have to generate everything. And so that means, because you can never generate everything, you are going to have to make stuff up on the fly. So that's a major penalty of the homebrew versus the pre-gen world, is you are making stuff up all the time as you're filling in the blanks, because there ain't nobody else who's done it beforehand. So when you look at all three different approaches, starting with the campaign idea, starting with the pre-gen, or starting with the homebrew, there are a lot of positives and there are a lot of negatives. How do you decide which one works for you? Ultimately, it's what sparks your imagination. What is your inspiration? Which one of those is your giant banana to get you to start coming up with ideas? I know, I myself frequently, I come up with wouldn't it be cool if the player characters had this as the final showdown? Or wouldn't it be cool if this was a possible scenario? I have times like that. I also have times where I'm going, I really want to run a Star Wars game. I just want to run a Star Wars game. So I'm choosing my next game based on what inspires me the most. But now you are forewarned. You now know which one of those you need to do, or not which one you need to do, but which one and what comes with each of those as positives and negatives. When I was coming up with a game, a homebrew game, a game, I wanted it to be unique. I wanted it to be different. I knew my players had excellent D&D knowledge. So I came up with my exploded planet and went, this makes sense. I created the world first, and from that exploded world, I then started to come up with my campaign. There is no order in which you have to do things. You can do them in any order, but by understanding the positives and the negatives, you create and understand the constraints that will then help you move forward. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. That's the end of today's video. Thank you for watching all the way through to the end. A massive thank you to our sponsor for today, and to all of my Patreons who keep this channel running. A huge thank you to you. And until next time, I wish you and you and you and you and you and you and all of you the happiest of gaming.